To merge or not to merge? Is that the only question that we should be asking? Super funds are increasingly under pressure to merge, sometimes almost at any cost. But we really do think that we should be giving some greater thought or deeper thinking to the results from the beneficiary's perspective. We think about it from a trustee's point of view, we think about it from a fund executive's perspective, but what sort of questions might a member ask? What value add might I gain from this merger? Will I in fact pay less because of scale? Do I really need or do I want more options on my super fund? And will services improve or will they in fact be customised? As a trustee or executive manager, there are many more questions to be answered in this process, and our panel will deliberate on these during the course of the session. We've got a terrific panel today who I'm sure you'll find collective pearls of wisdom, sure to inspire some greater thought before you may rush off to the big M. In order of presentation are Andrew Probstall, CEO of Legal Super, Gerard Noonan, Trustee, Director and Chair of Media Super, as well as President of ASI2010, and final but certainly not least is Graham Russell, CEO of First Super. Each will present for 7 to 8 minutes before we open up for dialogue with you. Please welcome Andrew to the podium.
My talk today will really revolve around having a look back on the questions of merger, but also trying to offer some thoughts about the future landscape in terms of mergers. And I guess with only a few moments, in fact minutes, to speak, I'll have to move fairly quickly and I won't be able to drill into very deeply, but I'll try and cover as many sort of thoughts as I can as we go along. I thought it was useful to have a look at the fairly substantial decline in the number of superannuation funds in Australia since 1996, some 15 years ago. So as you can see from the slide, about a 90% reduction in the number of funds has already occurred in the industry over the last 15 years, and indeed 50% reduction over the last 5 years. So I think when people talk about the potential for further rationalisation and consolidation in the industry, it's important to keep this sort of perspective in mind because there has already been very substantial consolidation. Really what this slide also bears out is that in fact market forces has had success in achieving rationalisation through the industry, and I think to some extent really whether government or whether regulators or others need to encourage consolidation, I'm not so sure. In some ways I look at that record and think the industry has already risen to the challenge of ensuring that it consolidates as is necessary and will no doubt continue to consolidate as is necessary. It might take time, but that will, I think, happen. If you look at the rate of consolidation by sector, over the last 15 years, corporate funds, the number of corporate funds has in fact reduced 15%, 31% over just the last 5 years. Industry funds and retail funds, as it happens, have reduced at approximately the same sort of rate, about 60% over the last 15 years, and in fact 80% at a higher rate over the last 5 years. Public sector funds have reduced in number 58% over the last 15 years and 89% over the last 5 years. So you can see some differences in the trends for rationalisation there, where in the last 5 years in particular for some sectors there's been a peak in consolidation. A lot of the discussion about merger seems to focus on the potential for cost savings, and given the particular fund that I come from, a medium-sized fund, I obviously will have a particular view about this issue. And that view is that the larger funds in the country do not necessarily have lower MERs compared to smaller funds, or indeed, in fact, the medium-sized funds have lower MERs than the very large funds. So I'll just take some time to explain this chart. What I've done is take information from the websites of industry funds, their annual report in particular, take the aggregate costs that they have for the 08-09 financial year and relate it to the average fund that they manage. And to sort of preserve some sense of, sort of survey-like result, that each bar represents the average of 3 funds in each of those different size categories. So it's sort of, hopefully, therefore, a little bit more representative than just looking at one fund. I have done more analysis on a broader basis, and this sort of trend is still there when you look across a larger sample of larger, medium and smaller funds. So when you look at this chart, what sort of hits you immediately is there's not that much difference in the MER between the different funds. Yes, big funds, 5 billion plus, at least in this chart, have a, 0.08%, 8 basis point lower MER compared to those funds between 1 and 2 billion. But as it turns out, the funds that were in this sample for the 2 to 4 billion, funds in the middle, in fact, have a lower MER than the very large funds, the 5 billion plus funds. Any analysis of this type, of course, can have other results when you expand the sample, but that's the group of funds that I looked at, and that's the result that came through. I think the other thing I'd say, I guess, around cost is sort of only one dimension of what super funds deliver to their members, and depending on the group of members that you serve, they may place a higher relative importance on quality of service, depth of service, breadth of service, the range of products that you offer, the range of services that you offer, and in some cases may be willing to pay a modest premium to get that expanded breadth of service or quality. I thought I'd share with you briefly some of the key points of Legal Super's experience with mergers. We've had 7 mergers in all, and our fund has grown from 108 million in 1999 to about 1.4 at the current date. All of the mergers that we have been involved with have involved legal sector funds, and for us, that has been a great way for us to cement our penetration of the legal profession in Australia and to create more and more, increasingly, a national fund for the legal profession. The great thing, I think, about mergers is it forces and encourages all participants to really review and critique the product and the service range of the fund. So it involves running tenders, it involves looking at other products that you could add in for the newly formed combined membership. And so it's a very healthy process that ends up giving better outcomes all round. Rationalisation of fund manager lineup. Often we would pick up the fund managers from the funds that were joining us, and we would consolidate those managers into our portfolio, and then over a reasonable period we would rationalise the portfolio back to where we thought it should be. And yes, through this process we did generate cost savings and efficiencies as a result. So looking forward, the other side of what I'm here to talk about today, I thought one way of doing this was to sort of have a look at the current makeup of the industry. And as you can see from this slide, in terms of number of funds, the largest sector is the corporate sector. In terms of number of funds, the second largest is retail funds, and then it flows to industry funds and public sector funds. So I guess if you were to sort of say, well, okay, well, if the industry was going to rationalise further, where is it most likely that rationalisation has possibility? And I think it'd be reasonable to say that where sectors have a higher number of funds, it is likely that there would be higher prospect for further consolidation. So if you accept that premise, we'd be saying that going forward, we'd expect to see further consolidation through the corporate and retail sectors. Obviously, industry and public sector will continue to rationalise as well, but it looks like, based on those numbers, there'll be possibly less opportunity for consolidation there. On this next slide, I'm sort of looking more deeply into the makeup of the different funds, the sort of fund size in the funds in these different sectors, to sort of try and again form some sort of view about where there's more possibility for consolidation. And if you look at this sort of perspective in terms of the corporate funds, you can see that in fact 89% of corporate funds have less than $2.5 billion. Or another way of looking at it, relatively small funds, 69, almost 70% of corporate funds have less than $1 billion. So I would sort of see that as a signal that there's fair scope for some further rationalisation in the corporate sector. Remembering, of course, that the corporate sector is probably the sector that has experienced the highest level of consolidation or rationalisation across the whole industry. The other observation I would make is, the 26% there for industry funds who have less than 500 million. You would have to send in the absence of any other factors that would suggest they should otherwise remain in the industry. That's quite a small level of FUM, and the questions about whether those funds will survive into the future would certainly hang in the air. I think also it's interesting to note that, in fact, in the retail sector, you've got the 30% of funds in the retail sector that are also less than $500,000. So they similarly, you would think, would have some question mark over them as well. Once you start looking at the billion-dollar plus funds, I think it's interesting also to note that the number of funds across those different ranges isn't that different across each of the sectors, with perhaps the exception of public sector funds for the $1 billion to $2.5 billion, which is a bit higher. So there's some signals there. And just in closing, I just wanted to make a few general comments about the situation looking forward. Consolidation, rationalisation of the number of funds in the country will inevitably have huge implications across the whole industry. If you look at it from just one perspective, every two funds that get together means that there is only one audit rather than two audits. There are only one tax return rather than two tax returns. So, and it ripples through at all levels. Less consulting income for different consulting work that's done, less FUM for fund managers to manage it, less mandates in particular for fund managers. So, yeah, this isn't just about looking at the number of funds reducing. There's a lot of impact across the industry that flows as a consequence. The suggestion or the ideas around member account consolidation occurring as well, which was something that came through in the Cooper Review, 30-something million accounts in the whole country for about 12 million working Australians. So perhaps on average is close to about three accounts per person, per working person in Australia. And the importance of member account consolidation and the impact it has on the industry as well is essentially revolving in the main around the fact that most fund administrators levy their fees on a per member basis. So, and when they do that, they end up with an aggregate amount that they get remunerated for the services they provide. If you reduce the number of members that are out there, then either the per member rate increases or the aggregate reduces, and I think you could quickly realise which one will happen. Administrators will say that the aggregate sum they're collecting is the true cost of running the fund, and that's what they'll look to collect. So there are those sorts of impact as well. Of course, some super funds recover a per member fee as well from their members for administration costs. Third point here is really achieving an equilibrium between fees and quality of products and services, and that was really the point I made earlier. I don't see it as just about fees. It's about fees and getting the sort of services and products that your membership wants to receive. That's really what it's about going forward into the future, differentiating the fund based on the services and the products that you provide. If you do that, then you will retain and grow your membership. I think the funds, therefore, those that have well-defined target markets, of course our fund, Legal Super, is a fund that focuses on the legal sector. We know the legal sector, we have connections into the legal sector, we have people on our board who work in the legal sector, we have connections into the associations, we survey our members. It's much easier for us to be in contact and aware of our particular members' needs. So I think that gives us very much an advantage going forward, and I think we will prosper if we get better and better about understanding our particular member demographic and delivering what they want. As an observation, I think medium-sized multi-industry funds are the ones that probably are going to come in under the spotlight the most. If a fund is a multi-industry fund that goes across several industries, why is what they do that different to a very, very large multi-industry fund? What is their point of difference that justifies their existence? So they're all sort of rather thorny sort of points and questions and things we will have to all deal with collectively in different ways. But I'm sure my two colleagues on the panel will help you further dealing with them going forward.
Thank you, Andrew. This is not really a self-portrait. I did once have a beard, although nowhere near as charming as Sigmund Freud's. And I'm here, in a sense, under false pretenses because you heard from Andrew, who had a multiple series of mergers, and you'll hear from Graham shortly, who's the result of 3 mergers. So I feel like I'm the chair of Media Super, which was the result of a merger between Print Super and Just Super in 2008. So just 2 funds merging. So I feel like the sort of the thin ham between these 2 rather substantial pieces of bread. However, I've been really asked to talk about something other than my own fund merger experience and have a look at something which often goes unremarked, but it is the psychology of mergers. Now, everybody who's here today will find this pretty familiar, I'm sure. Every organisation has a governance structure, which has developed over time, of course, and it looks something along these lines. You have boards with 1, 2 or 3 dominant personalities, what you might call the superegos. And by that I don't mean a reference to any Tom, Dick or Gary or Sandy that might be here. I think we all recognise that within all of our organisations we have 1, 2 or 3 dominant personalities. And then we have perhaps 3 or 4 engaged trustee directors, very professional, who only really care about the members and are less concerned about their role in driving the organisation. They rely mainly on the first group to take on that role. And then finally, and it's perhaps a mildly cruel way of describing it, but you've got 2 or 3 trustee directors who are broadly disengaged, who are committed enough, but who occasionally prioritise their own work or family commitments above the demands of the fund or board. Now, executives are of course relevant here in this process, because in each organisation there are a cluster of senior executives with roughly similar characteristics and personality traits as the trustee directors. So when the issue of mergers emerges, and that they are often externally stimulated by something like, Cooper-style inquiry or governmental nudging, kind of its issues about MERs, or a sequence of years of poor or sometimes outstanding performance, or simply a slowly germinating idea that the time has come, the nebulous "it's time" factor. It might be that there's an ageing board, a group of people who want to put the fruits of their 2 decades or so of hard labour and love into a good home, if you like, and they see that a merger with another organisation might be the way of doing that before they move off into the retirement homes. When those things occur, a new chemistry begins. The issue here is that with this chemistry at work, broadly speaking, this structure or this psychology is actually replicated in each organisation, and in my experience none are exempt from this. There's nothing special here, it's just simply a bit of organisational behaviour analysis, and it's just as relevant if it was an evangelical church or a publicly listed grocery company. So multiply this by 2 in any merger, and remember that each separate fund has alpha and beta executives and board members, and that equals trouble, or more politely, of course, an organisational challenge. So what acts as the spark in this process? In my experience, the driving force, or to maintain the metaphor, the pyromaniacs who light the fuse, come from the cluster of 1, 2 or 3 dominant alpha males or alpha females. They're the ones who drive the intellectual debate that a merger is in the best interests of the fund, and that surprisingly enough means the best interests of the members, despite the known hazards of setting out on this path. And there are significant hazards. The hazards are real. And one interesting thing that I've noticed in my own circumstances of the merger between our 2 funds, and I've talked to others who've gone through the same experience, they reflect the same thing. Mergers are easier to derail than to keep on track. It only really needs one person, a determined person, from that alpha group in particular, and the long time period that's involved means that a determined resistance movement can be easily led and be quite successful. And the negotiations can be pretty tricky. All of the people on the stage today have had experience of something that's been going on in Canberra, or something similar to what's been going on in Canberra in the last couple of weeks, with 3 alpha male independents negotiating with an alpha male Prime Minister and an alpha male Leader of the Opposition, and you can see how long that can take to lead to an outcome. The second thing I'd like to take from Sigmund Freud, the second Freudian factor, is the id. Now, it's not the id as in Sigmund Freud talked about the alter ego. I really mean id in a different sense. I mean id in the sense of identity, a sense of identity that a particular fund has. And remember here that we're dealing with at least 2 separate organisations with peculiar histories, dominated by strong personalities. Even if it is that the product that both organisations are dealing with is a pretty vanilla product. I know we like to accentuate our differences, but the truth of the matter is we do produce something that's pretty simple. We take, in the main, superannuation guarantee monies from people. We look after it for 40 years. We probably add on an insurance product, and then we hand it back to people. That's not a really complicated process. We all know here that it is really a complicated matter of managing, but it is, in terms of product, it's a pretty vanilla product. Nevertheless, around these products becomes a very strong sense of identity. Given that each of these 2 separate organisations, and in the case of Graham it's 3, and in the case of Andrew it was 9, is guaranteed to have a strong sense of identity, its own ID, that sense of identity is that sort of rootedness in the industry from which they're based. And again, it's typically articulated by those 1, 2 or 3 dominant personalities within those organisations. So ahead lies quite a tussle to ensure that the maximum good elements of the originating Fund A and the maximum good elements of the originating Fund B, for example, makes its way into the DNA of the newly merged entity. Now, in theory, this process should mimic the charming resolution of biological reproduction, with the genetic material from the 2 loving parents blending beautifully and seamlessly into the new organisation. But as we all know, in reality, the process of organisational coupling shows, in my experience, more signs of the scratching and biting that you typically find in a David Attenborough television series on the origins of life. Thank you.
Well, I think you've excelled yourself, Gerard. Not even I would be game enough to get up and call the Prime Minister an alpha male. Thank you and good morning. First of all, for those of you who attended this the session on mergers at CMSF, where I certainly know I had a good time presenting there, I want to start with a race result from the call of the card at CMSF, where I went through the call of the card for the merger hurdle. The winner was number 1, Members' Interests. Started as favourite, as I said, at CMSF. Got knocked around a bit in the back straight, got pulled a bit coming around home, but then it stormed home and it paid a handsome dividend. 11% is what we just paid. So to my directors, I told you I'd get the 11% in somehow, and there it is. On the screen you'll see the first super merger on the 30th of June 2008, which brought together the 3 funds in the forestry and forest-related products industries into First Super. And one of the reasons for hanging on to the name First Super was that the one in the middle, the Pulp and Paper Industry Fund, was founded in 1974, and hence the name First. And good morning to our good friends from Bluecliff. Benefits to members. Were there benefits to members? Yes, there were, and I've listed some of these, particularly for very small funds. And some of those funds, as you saw, were under $1 billion, a few hundred million. So for two of the three funds, it was the first opportunity to access allocated pensions, similarly to access full-time financial planning services. I think everyone who's been through a merger, Andrew and I were talking about this last night, insurance cover is one of the big benefits from a merger, that you certainly can negotiate much improved cover at lower costs, and I haven't heard anyone who hasn't been able to achieve that. And in our case, for some of our members, it was significantly improved cover. Expanded investment choices. One of our predecessor funds only had a default fund, didn't have any investment choices. We run our own call centre. Two of the funds really had very small offices, small staff, provided good service, but we were able to expand the call centre and expand the number of field staff that we had. And another important thing which has an impact on your costs as well as your investment options is that it provided us with sufficient scale to have direct mandates. And that's been a significant change, and in fact that made a significant contribution to our very good returns for the year just gone. And I'll go through some of the administration cost issues. Merger costs. To this day, I haven't actually sat down and gone through and done a 100% audit, but I can give you a reasonable idea. All up, the costs that are listed there, except for management and staff redundancies, and for reasons you'd understand, I'd probably not like to put that figure out there, but for the rest of the costs, probably added up to about 1.3, 1.4 million, which in case of the merged fund is only about 10 or 15 basis points. To get there. So the merger consultants and advisors fees, always going into these things, you need to get an independent consultant in to bring it all together. We probably spent about $500,000 on merger consultants and advisors and lawyers. On member and employer communication and rebranding, because obviously you have to redo everything, we spent somewhere in the order of another $500,000 to transfer 35,000 member records, probably cost us in excess of $100,000. And on investments, and I think I said this at CMSF, the one thing to really look out for is stamp duty on transfer of investments. That was a sleeper that just, I think Steve Rose in the audience somewhere, you'll remember day after day, week after week, there was a stamp duty official on the phone and it just snuck up on us, and it was the threat that kept on coming. It cost us somewhere in the order of, I've got a number here somewhere, it cost us about $170,000 to get our way through the stamp duty issues with all of the states and territories. And it was a long, hard road, and it took us more than 6 months to negotiate our way through that reasonably successfully with very small bills, but it was very difficult to explain to people that the underlying owners of the assets were the same people as they were the day before. Also, when rationalising investments, CGT is triggered, although there is one benefit of doing a merger in the midst of a global financial crisis, which was that there wasn't much CG to T. Regrettably, we fell, and Media Super the same. We fell between the periods when governments allowed the losses to be carried forward to the successor funds. So both First Super and Media Super did not get the benefit of carry forward tax losses. So that was regrettable. That would have been helpful, despite us arguing. Management and staff redundancies I've mentioned. Obviously 3 funds, 3 offices into one, but there were some costs on the way through with lease payouts and costs of run-off trustee liability insurance. But as I say, apart from the staff redundancy costs, probably about 1.3, 1.4 million. Ongoing cost savings are obvious, and look, I haven't quantified these for us because they'll be different for all of you, but 3 into 1. Obviously, there's a number of things on the list here that you'll recognise and realise that that's where you can save some money. Are the cost savings real? And I apologise, where I've got MER there, it should have been the non-investment cost MER. I can tell you what it will end up. But are the cost savings real? Where's the evidence? Well, the first thing is our members' admin fee is $1.35 a week. It has been from TIS, the predecessor fund, since 2006. There's no change in 2010. I don't expect any change in 2011. In fact, I think we'll be able to maintain that fee at that level for quite some time. if I add in the investment costs to MER, to our management costs, in fact 2010 the management costs will come down to more like about 0.65, at about 0.5, and we actually end up, amazingly, without consultation, slap bang in the middle of where Andrew showed you on the slide, about 1.1, 1.2, but falling, I think. And to come at it another way, have a look at the total expenditure of the three funds in 06-07 and our budget for 10-11. You'll see there's a higher amount in 8-9, and that's because there's transitional costs. 10-11 is where we're really starting to invest in expanding services to our members. So I think, for us, the evidence is there, and it's there in members' accounts week in, week out with the fee. Major challenges. Member records transfer, obviously, is something that you just have to get right. We did pretty well, although one of the administrators who was losing the business made it a bit difficult for us and wasn't exactly falling over themselves to cooperate with us. But we managed I think we were shut down for 6 working days. So I think we shut down at about lunchtime on the 30th or the 29th, whatever the Friday was, and we were back up and running Monday a week later. So that was a very good outcome as a result of good planning. Management staff rationalisation is always going to be a challenge, because what you're trying to do, with the best will in the world, there are people who are not going to be there after the merger process, and so keeping them motivated and engaged is a real challenge, and I'm not sure that that I did as well as I could have there. Investment transition and costs, probably the most complex thing in a merger, and you can see there, again, in the midst of the GFC, you've all of a sudden inherited 61 investments and 50 different managers, and it took 18 months to 2 years to slice both of those numbers roughly in half. Andrew mentioned too, selecting outsourced service providers, a long process. It takes a lot of time to go through and select investment consultants, custodians. In our case, we're self-administered, so at least that wasn't an issue. Retaining members' loyalty post-merger has been a challenge. For some members, there's no real change. They've got the same membership number, it's the same phone number, it's the same people they used to talk to. For some of our members, it's the same name, so that's not such a difference. But for one group of our members, it was a change in every respect, and it's been quite challenging for us to retain their loyalty. And in fact, in the last 3 months, we've been back in there with a major campaign to, frankly, win back the loyalty of some groups of members. And I'll finish by saying merger day is only the halfway mark. It is only the halfway mark, and don't kid yourself if you're going into a merger that, on the 1st of July, it's let's go out for lunch and have some champagne. It took us probably 12 to 18 months to finalise all the things that needed to be done to implement the merger.
Thank you, Gerard. I'm sure there are many questions to come from the audience. There are some roving mics, but I might just open to the panel, and if each of you could just answer this. Could you just name one of the most complex issues that you came across in achieving a merger?
I think not necessarily most challenging perhaps, but the one particular thing you need to focus on most, and it's probably really what Gerard was speaking about, is the psychology of the different people that you're speaking with. It's really important, I think, to establish trust between the two funds and the two boards, and that needs to also, of course, flow through to the management team. So I think the challenge is really establishing that trust. If you get that right, all the mechanical stuff just falls into line behind it.
Gerard.
Look, the short version of that is probably having two CEOs, and then having to work out that at the end you're only going to have one CEO. So that's the most difficult of the issues in trying to work it through.
And Graham.
Look, I think I touched on it when I was talking. I think, and maybe it was complicated by being in the middle of a global financial crisis at the time, but the rationalisation of investments and investment managers and the relationships. I can remember one investment manager when we terminated them called me, and this was 6 months after, and said how disappointed they were that they'd been terminated. And I said, well, look, let's face it, I've been here and we merged 6 months ago and I've never spoken to you or heard from you, you know, because you had so many managers and so many investments. And so I think for us that was the most complicated.
Questions from the audience?
I'd be interested to hear from the panel whether they think it's more difficult to merge two organisations of the same size, or three in Graham's case. I'm not sure the size of your funds were different, but or to merge one fund that's larger than the others. So is there more challenge when you've got two of the same size?
It certainly is a factor in the discussions and the negotiations that lead up to it, and there's a fair deal of sort of preening that goes on, I suppose, in advance of this, that we're bigger than you, therefore we need better representation on the final board structure, or we've got a better performance over the past 5 years, so therefore we really should be in the driving seat as far as the investment rationalisation is concerned, and the advisory groups that you bring into these mergers, and that is a factor that we probably haven't talked about at all, so that you've got administrators and custodians and asset consultants and so on from both organisations, and they're not necessarily going to be the same ones, and which of those survive is a bit of a factor, and it does tend to be the larger, in my experience, arguing that they should have better representation. The problem is in getting it, if they're too far apart though, it's not really a merger, it's a takeover. And that's one of the issues that, although we don't ever utter that word, and we do talk about it throughout the process as a merger, it has all the elements of a corporate takeover about it, and that creates ultimately, I think, a degree of resentment. Perhaps not so much on the part of individual members of the funds, but at the organisational level, it's an extra degree of difficulty when that occurs.
Graham, would you like to comment? One of your funds was certainly far smaller.
Yeah, look, I think the issue for me, I think Jared's right, that a very large fund taking over a small fund, pretty much looks like a takeover to me. However, with the best will in the world, I think that's kind of how you'll end up. With the three funds that I'm involved with, they weren't that different. I think the key issue is the culture of the organisations that are involved, and because I was also on the merger subcommittee for Media Super, there was a stark contrast. In the first super merger, for example, all three funds, the employee representatives were represented by representatives of the same union. So we had the same union in all three funds, and there weren't any issues there. And I think also the employers' side, the industries were at least related. So it was forestry and pulp, paper and forest products. So it was actually more about the culture, and in that case, the cultures were all a very nice fit anyway. There was some cross-representation on some of the boards, so that wasn't really an issue there. But if I contrast that with the Media Super merger, there was a substantial difference in the culture between Print and Just. And in fact, we had a go at merging Print and Just 10 years earlier, probably, and the cultural disconnect between the two was the thing that actually brought it unstuck. So in terms of the first super merger, there was a collective decision, let's go, and so off we went. In terms of Media Super, I think Jared was alluding to it, but I'm not on the board anymore, so I can say it bluntly. That merger almost derailed 3 or 4 times through the process, and it actually took a lot of concerted effort to say, we are going to see this through, we are going to see this through. And partly it was because of the culture. So, for example, on the union side, you had a blue-collar union representing moderately paid workers on one side, and a white-collar union / professional association almost, Chris Warren's going to kill me for saying it, on the other side. And so, there were very significant cultural differences, and I think that's the key issue.
There seems to be a lot of time and effort that is spent on mergers. Is there Did you consider other ways of getting better benefits from a member's point of view instead of merging? For instance, collective investment or collaborative collaboration on things like compliance or communication, for instance?
Well, in our case, our asset consultant, Jana, provides an investment platform which we have some of our investments on, and by virtue of that we get access to scale that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get to. It's one of the key things that often doesn't get airplay is that smaller, medium-sized funds can get access to scale by virtue of their service providers. They don't need to necessarily themselves be large organisations. They can think innovatively and access scale that other organisations have acquired. So that's one way we've done it, I think on an ongoing basis we can, or in particular I, continue to have discussions with CEOs of other similarly sized funds to identify ways that we can work collectively, and I'm sure those sorts of discussions will continue.
Oh, a question for Graham. As I understand it, you've taken the administration of your fund in-house, and at 0.77%, there wouldn't appear to be any cost savings there. So why did you do that?
The fund TIS already owned an administration company, so that was just a continuation of the arrangement there. And I'm jumping to the numbers, and as I said when I put that slide up, I think the management costs for this year, based on an expanding budget, are going to be down to about 0.65, and the administration company is profitable, and we're able to maintain, I think, as I said, the members' admin fee of $1.35 a week, I think stacks up against our peers and some of the bigger funds, quite reasonably. So I think we're certainly in a good position, and we are basically in Andrew's middle bar, I think, there on his chart, and with our costs or our expense ratio likely to decrease as the fund grows, but our costs don't.
Keith Davies from PwC. I've been in the industry a long time and experienced mergers myself through organisations I've worked for, and in recent years the number of investment managers that have merged, and of course now a lot of mergers of super funds. And one of the key factors that seems to be constantly overlooked in mergers is actually holding the key people and keeping them focused on the job through the process, and then knowing that some of them are going to disappear, and how you actually go to hold those people in. And it's usually the better people that can find the jobs easily elsewhere who move out. What, in your experience, how did you go about keeping those good people on board?
It's obviously a problem. In the case in the case of MediaSuper, one of the devices that we used to kind of hold the centre, if you like, to avoid what Graham referred to as, kind of 3 or 4 times when things looked like they were going to fall apart, even though publicly there was no sort of sense of that. In fact, people after the whole thing said to me, "Oh, that was a very smooth merger," and I was reminded of being a duck with a, moving smoothly above the water, but actually paddling hard underneath. We actually used a rather, you might sound a rather crude device, but it did serve its purpose, and it still is serving its purpose, in fact, and that was in the small group from the 2 separate funds that were merging. Graham was one of the people, and there were representatives from Prince Super on there. So it was a group of 5 senior, probably the alpha group within the 2 funds. Sat down, and we then got out a sheet of paper and kept it to 1 page, and we put 20 dot points on it. And about dot point 3 was, in the whole merger process, all staff will retain their positions. And it was actually a really important thing in being able to go for both organisations to say, look, no matter what the shape of the new organisation, your position is not under threat. So you're not actually going to have to go and find another job. Now, we knew that the end result of the whole process was that we weren't going to end up with X plus Y staffing and have that at the end of the process. But but we also knew that it was going to take a number of years to do, and that heads of agreement, which I must say also included some rather obvious things like who's going to be the CEO. So that wasn't up for grabs. It was actually decided in a group of 5 of the directors at the very beginning process. As it happened, it was convenient in this case that the 2 chairs, I was the chair from actually the smaller fund, but the chair of the larger fund had decided that he wanted to retire within the next year or so. So that actually took that one out of play. So it was easy to actually say the chair of the new fund will be Noonan. And it was just a dot point, a series of dot points. And it was raised earlier about the difference in the sizes of the 2 organisations. I think, Angela, you raised that question. In constructing the new board, that had to be recognised that there was one fund was bigger by probably 20% bigger, and they insisted that they had a stronger representation on the board, and that was a sticking point actually at one stage. So we actually wrote that out in the heads of agreement, exactly how the numbers would work on the board for the next 2 years, and then then after the 2-year period, how they'd resolve themselves as well. So it sounds like a rather crude instrument to put in place, but it actually was the document that actually guided the process in our case all the way through, and it gave security to those members of the staff that they weren't about to be thrown overboard. And so it was an important factor in it. It doesn't really explain your question, however, about how you retain the best people, and we've lost some of those, that's true. So it's kind of not easy organisationally, but that was one way of handling it.
Thank you.